The iron edge of the spade bit into the callus with a sound like a bone snapping in a dry throat. Elias Thorne didn't stop to wipe the stinging salt from his eyes, even as the midday sun hammered a rhythmic, molten pulse into the back of his neck. He was 6 feet deep in his own penance, or so he told himself, carving a hole in the white crust earth of the high desert. Behind him, the mule, Barnaby, shifted his weight, the rhythmic jingle of his harness sounding like coins on a dead man's eyes. The body sat slumped against a nearby Joshua tree, wrapped tight in a charcoal gray oilcloth that had seen better winters. It wasn't a heavy body, wasted away by the lung fever until there was nothing left but gristle and secrets, but it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds to Elias. That was his brother, Caleb, or what was left of him after 30 years of whiskey and bad intentions. Elias had promised to bury him here, at the edge of the sun-scourged flats, where the wind supposedly blew the sins off a man's name. Elias heaved another shovelful of white grit over his shoulder, the dust coating his tongue until every breath tasted of ancient, dried-up seas. The silence of the desert was absolute, a heavy, velvet shroud that pressed against his eardrums. There were no birds here, no scorpions, nothing but the heat and the ghosts Elias had invited along for the ride. He drove the spade down again, expecting the jarring resistance of stone, but the earth gave way with a sickening, hollow thud. He froze, his hands trembling against the smooth hickory of the shovel handle. The sound hadn't been the scrape of rock, it had been the muffled groan of splintering wood. He looked down at the bottom of the pit, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. A jagged, dark hole had opened up in the white soil, revealing a glimpse of something that didn't belong in a virgin grave. He knelt in the dirt, his fingers clawing at the loose earth like a starving dog. He cleared away the grit, exposing a patch of rough-hewn pine, rotted and soft from some subterranean moisture he couldn't explain. His breath hitched as he realized he wasn't digging a grave, he was reopening one. The box below was small, too small for a man, and the wood was stained a dark, ominous rust color that made the hair on the back of his neck prickle. Elias almost stood up and ran then, almost left Caleb to the vultures and the sun, but the curiosity was a hook in his gut. He used the tip of the spade to pry at the rotted lid, the wood screaming as it gave way. Inside, nestled in a bed of decayed silk that might have been white, lay a figure. It wasn't a skeleton. The salt in the soil had mummified the flesh, turning it into a dark, translucent parchment stretched tight over delicate bones. It was a woman. She wore a high-collared dress of deep burgundy, the lace at the throat still intact, though blackened by time. Her hands were folded over her chest, clutching a small silver locket that caught the direct glare of the sun and threw a blinding spark into Elias's eyes. He recoiled, his boot slipping on the loose earth as he scrambled back to the corner of the pit. "Finding what you're looking for, Thorne?" The voice was thin and reedy, like wind blowing through a cracked rib cage. Elias spun around, his hand flying to the holster at his hip, but his fingers found only empty air. He'd left the peacekeeper on the mule's saddle, 20 feet away. Standing at the edge of the grave was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of the same dry wood as the coffin. He wore a duster the color of wood smoke, and a hat pulled so low his eyes were nothing but twin pits of shadow. He held a long-barreled Sharps rifle across the crook of his arm, the muzzle pointed casually at Elias's chest. "I don't want no trouble," Elias said, his voice cracking. "I'm just burying my brother. I didn't know someone was already here." The stranger didn't move, didn't blink. He just stared down at the mummified woman in the hole, a strange, mournful tilt to his head.
"The desert has a memory for things men want to forget," the stranger said. He stepped closer to the edge, the salt crust crunching under his boots like breaking glass. "That woman in the burgundy dress, do you recognize the locket, Elias? Or have you forgotten the face of the woman you left in Laramie?" Elias felt the world tilt. The name Laramie hit him like a physical blow, a cold spike driven through the heat of the day. He looked down at the woman again, his vision blurring. He remembered a fire, a screaming town, and the weight of a gold-heavy satchel in his hand. He'd told everyone she died in the flames. He'd told himself he'd tried to save her. "I don't know who you are," Elias whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. He almost reached for the woman's hand, almost touched the cold parchment skin to see if she would wake and scream his name, but the stranger shifted the rifle. The metallic clack of the hammer being cocked echoed in the pit like a thunderclap. "My name is Silas," the man said, "and I've been digging this same hole for 12 years, Elias. Every time I get close to the truth, the wind fills it back in. But today, the wind is quiet." Silas sat on the edge of the grave, his legs dangling into the pit. He looked tired, older than the hills, his skin mapped with 1,000 lines of grief. The tension between them was a physical weight, a third person in the grave. Elias gripped the shovel, the wood slick with his sweat. He could lunge, could drive the blade into the stranger's throat before the rifle could swing, but his legs felt like they were made of water. He was a man who had built a life on a foundation of sand, and the tide was finally coming in. "She isn't supposed to be here," Elias said, his voice a ragged sob. "She died in the fire at the Gilded Rose. I saw the roof come down. I saw it." Silas laughed, a dry, hacking sound that ended in a cough. He reached into his duster and pulled out a small leather-bound book, the edges charred and blackened. "The rose burned, true enough," Silas said, flipping through the pages. "But Clara wasn't in it. You took her out the back way, Elias. You took her to the flats because she saw you kill the paymaster. You didn't want a witness, not even one you claimed to love." He tossed the book into the grave. It landed on the woman's burgundy lap, a final piece of evidence in a trial that had waited a decade to begin. Elias almost grabbed the book, almost shredded the pages and swallowed them to hide the shame, but Silas's shadow fell over him, cold and long. "I didn't kill her," Elias lied, the words tasting like ash. "We were ambushed, raiders. They took her, and I thought I lost her." Silas didn't argue. He just pointed at the woman's neck. "Look closer, Elias. Look at the bone." Elias leaned down, his face inches from the mummified remains. The burgundy lace was torn, revealing a jagged dark line across the vertebrae. It wasn't a bullet wound. It was the clean, deep mark of a blade, the same blade Elias still carried in his boot. The power in the pit shifted. Elias wasn't the grieving brother anymore. He was a cornered wolf. He looked at Barnaby, the mule, who was watching them with wide, dark eyes. The peacekeeper was so close, just a few strides away. If he could distract Silas, if he could create one moment of chaos, he could end this. He could bury them all together, Caleb, Clara, and this ghost named Silas. "You've got a lot of talk for a man with a rifle," Elias spat, his fear turning into a jagged, defensive rage. He reached for the canteen at his waist, his movement slow and deliberate. He almost offered it, almost showed a moment of false mercy, but his fingers brushed the hilt of the knife in his boot. Silas didn't take the bait. He didn't look at the canteen. He looked at the horizon, where the heat was distorting the land into a shimmering, watering mirror. "I stopped being thirsty a long time ago. I only have one thing left to do, and then I can finally find a patch of shade that don't move." A sudden wind whipped up, a dust devil that danced across the flats and slammed into the grave. It filled the air with blinding white grit, stinging Elias's eyes and clogging his throat. He saw his chance. He lunged upward, not for the spade, but for Silas's legs, intending to drag the man down into the pit. His fingers almost closed around the rough wool of the duster, almost pulled the ghost into the dirt, but Silas moved with a speed that defied his age. The butt of the Sharp's rifle slammed into Elias's temple, sending a galaxy of stars exploding across his vision. He fell back, his head hitting the pine coffin with a sickening crack. The world went gray at the edges, the heat of the sun replaced by a cold, numbing fog. He could feel the burgundy silk of Clara's dress against his cheek, the smell of ancient dust and copper filling his nose.
"You were always a clumsy liar, Elias." Silas's voice sounded far away, as if he was speaking from the top of a mountain. Elias tried to move, but his limbs were heavy, pinned down by the weight of the earth he'd spent the morning digging. He looked up and saw Silas standing over him, but the man didn't have the rifle anymore. He had the spade. The first shovelful of white earth hit Elias in the chest, the weight of it crushing the air from his lungs. "Wait!" Elias wheezed, his voice a thin whistle. "I have the gold. I can tell you where it is. It's not in the satchel. I buried it by the red buttes. Just let me up." Silas didn't stop. Another spade full of grit covered Elias's legs. "The gold is just yellow stone, Elias. It doesn't pay the toll for where you're going." The dirt began to rain down in a steady rhythmic cadence. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like the beating of a heart or the ticking of a clock that had finally run out of time. Elias almost screamed, almost begged for his life, but the dust filled his mouth, a dry, choking gag of salt and sin. He looked at Clara, her dark parchment face seemingly tilted toward him in the dimming light of the pit. He realized then that the twist wasn't that Silas had found him. The twist was that Caleb wasn't in the oilcloth. Caleb had died years ago. Elias had been carrying a roll of rocks and old clothes for 3 days, a prop for a performance of grief he'd been playing for a ghost. He'd come here to bury his own guilt, but the desert had already provided a witness. The woman in the burgundy dress wasn't a discovery. She was an invitation. The dirt rose to his chin, the weight of the earth pressing against his ribs until his heart struggled to find the room to beat. He looked up one last time and saw Silas's face clearly in the fading light. The man didn't look like a vengeful spirit. He looked like a mirror, the same scar on the chin, the same crooked set to the nose. "Who are you?" Elias managed to gasp, the salt burning his throat. Silas stopped digging for a moment, the spade resting on the rim of the grave. He leaned down, his shadow swallowing Elias whole. "I'm the man you should have been. I'm the part of you that didn't run. I'm the part that stayed in the fire." He stood up and heaved the final shovelful of white caliche directly onto Elias's face. The darkness was immediate and absolute. Elias felt the crushing pressure of the earth, the silence of the flats becoming a permanent, suffocating reality. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think. He was just a body in a hole, shared with a woman in a burgundy dress and a charred book of secrets. Above ground, Elias Thorne, or the man who called himself Silas, stood by the filled grave. He didn't mark it with a cross. He didn't say a prayer. He walked over to the mule, Barnaby, and untied the oilcloth bundle from the saddle. He let the rocks spill out into the dirt, the sound of their impact the only eulogy Elias would ever receive. He found the peacekeeper in the holster and tucked it into his own belt. He looked at the horizon, where the sun was finally sinking behind the jagged teeth of the mountains, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and dying orange. The heat was fading, replaced by the sharp,
fighting chill of the high desert night. Silas took the bridle of the mule and began to walk. He didn't look back at the grave, didn't look back at the white crust flats. He just walked toward the shadows, his boots making a steady, lonely sound against the salt. The desert was quiet again, the wind picking up a few grains of dust and swirling them over the fresh mound of earth until the surface was as blank and unmarked as a blank page. The locket, dropped in the struggle, lay half buried in the dirt a few feet away. It caught the last sliver of the sun's light, a tiny defiant spark of silver in a world of gray. Then the sun dipped below the rim, and the spark went out.